On the afternoon of August the 20th, 2008, the Beijing Olympic Games were in full swing. In the distant city of Madrid, Spain, a passenger plane crashed just 10 seconds after takeoff, killing 154 people. A McDonnell Douglas MD-82 passenger plane with registration number ECHFP and flight number 5022 was preparing for takeoff at Barajas Airport in Madrid, Spain. The flight carried 166 passengers and 6 crew members, and its destination was Gran Canaria Airport in the Canary Islands. The entire flight was expected to take about 3 hours. The captain of this direct flight was 39 years old and very experienced. The co-pilot was 31 years old and had been hired by Iberia the year before. At about 1:30 p.m., the crew reported to the tower that they were ready for takeoff and were waiting for instructions in front of runway 36. The tower replied that they could take off normally, but just a few seconds later, the crew reported to the tower again that the temperature sensor of the aircraft showed an abnormality, and they would not take off for the time being and needed to leave the runway. The tower approved the crew's request. The probe is designed to detect the temperature near the surface of the aircraft. When an object moves quickly in the air, it compresses the air and makes it hotter. This is particularly evident on high-speed jet aircraft. The aircraft needs to measure this temperature for 2 main reasons. The first is so that the pilot can decide whether to turn on the anti-icing switch. The second reason is related to autopilot, especially the autothrottle, if the air sensor senses high temperature. This means that the aircraft is moving quickly. At this time, the engine power needs to be reduced, considering its important role in engine thrust, etc. For safety reasons, the crew decided to suspend takeoff and return to the gate. The captain suspected that the temperature sensor was receiving an unexpected current. The maintenance department suggested that the crew restart the Z29 circuit breaker, which is powered by the rat heating element. But even so, the temperature of the detector did not drop. The engineers tried many ways to reduce the temperature of the probe, even using dry ice to cool it. The passengers all hoped that the plane could take off as soon as possible. At this time, the temperature outside was over 30 degrees. The aircraft was in a shutdown state and could not be fully cooled. The temperature in the cabin was gradually rising. Passengers and crew members began to feel anxious. An hour had passed, but the sensor had not been repaired. The maintenance personnel suggested that the heater power of the probe be turned off. The crew agreed to this plan, because the aircraft had returned to the gate, and the engine was turned off. The crew needed to go through the takeoff process again. First, the crew needed to report the takeoff mission to air traffic control. Only after obtaining permission could they proceed. According to the cockpit recording, the crew was delayed, causing them to be a little perfunctory in preparing for takeoff. The captain even asked the tower directly when to take off. This seems to be a normal work conversation, but you have to know that this was originally the job of the co-pilot. It can be seen from this that the captain had begun to worry after the engine started. The crew needed to complete 8 more inspection tasks. When the co-pilot checked the last item about the flaps and slats, the captain interrupted him directly and asked the co-pilot to ask the tower for taxiing permission again. However, after the call, the crew did not continue with this last check. When the plane finally started to taxi to the runway, the crew checked the taxi checklist. One of the items required the pilot to check the indicator light of the backup automatic thrust system. This light should be on, indicating that if there is an engine failure during takeoff, additional automatic thrust can be used. However, if the slats are not configured correctly, this light will not be on. However, the crew did not notice that there was another opportunity to find out that the flaps were not set. This was during the takeoff briefing, which required the pilot to observe the takeoff speed, flaps, and other parameters. But the cockpit recording shows that the pilot did not complete this task. When the plane began to align with the runway, the co-pilot performed a final check. He checked the center of gravity, the flaps, and the slats on the LCD screen. The indicator recording shows that the co-pilot said flaps 11, but the flaps were not set to the 11 position, and the number displayed on the LCD screen was also 0. Wasn't it visible? The investigation team concluded that this was a case of expectation bias. The co-pilot subjectively believed that the flaps were set to the parameter value he mentioned, he merely read the checklist mechanically without looking up to check the instrument. In simple terms, we only see what we expect to see. This is especially true when the psychological state is not good. The crew at this time was in such an anxious state. The captain should have supervised the co-pilot to check the checklist. Perhaps because he was queuing on the runway at the time, his attention was diverted to the window. The speed of the aircraft reached 157 knots at this time. The co-pilot began to control the aircraft to take off, but at this moment, the stall alarm sounded, and the plane tilted 32 degrees to the right, and then continued to climb to 12 meters. The co-pilot initially thought that the engine had failed, and reduced the thrust for this, and then he increased the throttle, but this had no effect. The plane began to descend and slid forward in a tail-first touchdown manner, and eventually crashed at the end of the runway. The plane broke into at least 2 pieces, accompanied by a strong fire and violent explosion. The accident caused 154 of the 172 people to die. The Spanish Civil Aviation Administration quickly set up an investigation team. The crew failed to deploy the flaps in time, which was the main cause of the air crash. In fact, at the beginning of the event, when the crew first noticed the sensor's abnormal reading, the aircraft could have taken off normally at that time without any problems, even if the RAT sensor's temperature reading was abnormal. It didn't matter. This issue had occurred on many aircraft. In fact, the probe itself is equipped with a heating component, so it will not freeze when flying at high altitudes. However, if the sensor is activated on the ground, it will naturally produce erroneous readings. This does not mean that the crew's caution was unwarranted, but their patience and safety awareness seemed to have evaporated in the scorching heat of the tarmac. Faced with delays and passengers urging, they began to hastily check the checklist, skipping key items, and even skipping visual inspections. Another important factor was the failure of the takeoff warning system, TOWS, which may have been related to the RAT heating element's malfunction. However, after checking and testing the relevant components, the investigation team could not determine the cause of the TOWS failure. The investigation team required that the procedures for the aircraft models involved in the accident be modified so that pilots could test the TOWS before each flight. The report also mentioned that during takeoff, if the co-pilot had kept the nose below 13 degrees instead of pulling it to 18 degrees, the result might have been different. Well, today's story ends here. May miracles reappear, and may air crashes no longer happen. See you next time.